me talk about acting for a moment. I studied first at the University of Miami. I was there for 6 months. I did a monologue, Friends, Romans, Countrymen, from Julius Caesar. Later I found out what the monologue actually meant. I realized it made no sense what I was doing, but the Fred Koch, I think his name was, head of the department, said, if you work hard enough, you could go anywhere. I then went to the Pittsburgh Playhouse where they didn't know anything. They literally didn't know anything, and they just, I don't even remember what they did. They mostly made fun of people. These are the teachers. One teacher thought it was amusing to zip and unzip his fly quite a bit as he was teaching. I'm not making any of this up. Then I spent a year and a half there, kind of survived it. Did some summer stock locally outside of Pittsburgh. Got a letter of recommendation from somebody who liked what I was doing and flew out to Hollywood and met a top PR woman named Helen Ferguson, who said the following to me. She said, your impact on entering a room is as though someone just left. Okay. Then I auditioned for the talent program at Warner Brothers, and I was too naive to realize I shouldn't really play. I played the young fella in Tea and Sympathy, where we're not sure if he's gay, he's not gay, so I didn't know then that gay people can sound anyway. So I talked more in a kind of in a lighter tone. I talked like that, and they said, have your agent call us. Well, I didn't have an agent, so I went to the Yellow Pages on Sunset Boulevard, literally, and looked up agents. And I told them I just auditioned. I got a guy on the phone, and he called and they said, really, have your agent call? He didn't know me, but he called the head of the talent department over there, a guy named William Orr, who was the son-in-law of Jack Warner. And I called him back and said, so what do they want to do with me? And he said, they don't want to do anything with you. They feel your quality is too light. I said, no, I was just doing that for the part. Well, nobody was interested in the explanation. So I then headed back, but somebody who worked with me on that scene, Tea and Sympathy, said, I don't know why you're here. Why don't you go back to New York and study acting? So that's what I did. And I started, I did 3 years then with Uta Hagen, who essentially was a bully. There was not one thing she said, looking back in those 3 years, that had any value at all. What she primarily was doing was teaching us how to carry an imaginary suitcase, I'm not making any of this up, or open an imaginary window. And I was the only one in the class who dared. This started when I was 10 years old, and I was impeached as president of my 5th grade class by daring to ask questions. I was kicked out of Hebrew school by daring to ask the rabbi, what do the Hebrew words mean that you're asking us to recite over and over on the blackboard? I was kicked out of economics class because I asked, I don't quite understand. I was an A student, I was the valedictorian, I was president of the class. Nobody else was asking, so I asked, kicked me out again. And so on to Uta Hagen in New York, same thing. Excuse me, why are we carrying imaginary suitcases and opening imaginary windows? She was so offended that anybody even asked her. I didn't know. I was serious. I was sincere. I wasn't trying. I thought maybe there's something I'm missing because I couldn't quite understand how this was going to turn into that. And I later learned that there are certain people, she was one, and later Roman Polanski in the movies, they really resent if you ask them anything. They, like this, John Cassavetes and Roman, I did Rosemary's Baby with him, and Cassavetes and Roman Polanski, because Cassavetes was a friend of mine, and we believe in, like, talking, going back and forth. Polanski didn't. Mia Farrow told me that Polanski and Cassavetes almost got into a fist fight over this. So it was useless. And 3 years of this carry imaginary suitcases, open imaginary windows, and then when I was doing, and all this time I'm trying to think of what do you do? How do you do this? So I read every book on acting. The one I particularly remember by Michael Chekhov, and he talked about the psychological gesture. I have no idea what that means either. I guess if you point at someone, it's a psychological gesture. It still doesn't make you an actor. What makes you an actor is that you can be relaxed in front of a camera or on stage, and you listen to a person the way you do in life, and then you respond the way you do in life. Now, how do you get to that state? In other words, it's easier said than done. Mostly, my benefit from 3 years of Uwe Hagen and then 3 years of Lee Strasberg was that I was constantly getting up and doing scenes. I wasn't necessarily any good, but I was getting used to being up in front of people. That was essential. And then one day, and when I got to Lee Strasberg, he wanted us all to go up and take an imaginary shower. So by that time, I had already learned. I don't think I'm going to ask him, what's the point of taking an imaginary shower? He also wanted us, as a relaxation exercise, to go up on stage with 20 other people, they still do this, and try to fall asleep in a chair, which is going to teach you how to fall asleep in a chair. It's not going to teach you how to be an actor. But one day, about 2 years into the 3 years I spent with him, out of the blue, he says to somebody that you could see, people could do scenes in there. There were wonderfully gifted people, right from the Pittsburgh Playhouse to Uwe Hagen to Lee Strasberg. 99% of them I never saw again because the rejection was so intense. But 2 years in with Lee Strasberg, suddenly out of nowhere, he gestures over to me and he says, do what he does. Well, that meant a lot. And when I opened on Broadway in same time next year with Ellen Burstyn, he was the first person back in my dressing room. It had been 13 years later since I'd seen him. He was the first person. I said, do you remember me? Because there's a lot of students. He said, of course I remember you. So he gave me a lot of confidence. But he went on and he acted in I think he played Meyer Lansky in the Godfather movies, and he himself will admit that he wasn't very good. Just to quote him, he was camera conscious. In other words, he wasn't able to do, well, most of them, the people don't make a living. I mean, Uwe Hagen starred on Broadway, and the teachers who wanted to be actors at the Pittsburgh Playhouse said they actually couldn't actually do this. And so basically what I'm saying is acting is very simple to do. You have to have a situation exist the same way you do in life. And you have to find a way, if you're supposed to hate someone, if you're supposed to be happy, if you're supposed to be sad, whatever it is, that you somehow in yourself find something that will evoke that in you, but it has absolutely nothing to do with an imaginary suitcase or an imaginary shower or an imaginary opening an imaginary window. So I think the value of studying acting is getting up and doing scenes. The danger is a lot of people are talking who have no idea what they're talking about, and they've never made a living doing this very thing. My son, when he began to be an actor, I looked around, I found out who has the best, who's the best reputation, and I got him in there. And within a short period of time, he wasn't saying very much, my son, and I said, "Are you doing scenes?" No, I'm not doing scenes. What are you doing? This is over about a three-month period. He says, "We're reciting poems." Also a complete waste of time, study to be an actor. Then the teacher, I'm deliberately not mentioning his name because he's a nice guy, he means well. He was on the phone with me telling me that my son should take a movement class. That's another one. It's basically a dance class, which would be good if you want to be a dancer, I guess, but it's got nothing to do. You can be in the movies or on stage without taking a dance class or a movement class or whatever they want to say. Then he sent me his book, this teacher, and he wanted to get a quote from me on the back of the book. And I tried to be graceful with him because I read a little bit of it, and it was like it could give you a headache and make you want to take a nap instantly. It was so, as my son says, and he said it very well, says the way they do this is they teach things that anybody could do it. Anybody could, maybe you're better than me carrying an imaginary suitcase. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a big acting career. So they do things that anybody could do. Now here's the main point that people should understand, because I run into people all the time who want to be actors, actresses. Yeah, I just graduated NYU school, this school, that school, that school. This is not exact, but I can tell you the amount of people who go into show business to be actors who actually make a living is probably less than 5% of the people. The people that you've heard of is closer to like 1%. So once you know that, you should understand that. And then you have not only the acting teachers, but there was a big executive at the William Morris Agency who said to me, if I didn't make it by the time I was 30, I should just leave. Well, I just chose not to tell him I was 32. And even though I had been in 2 Broadway hits, was guest starring in television, all of that, that didn't mean I didn't make it because he meant money. And then a few months later, I was in Rosemary's Baby. Then I started to move up the things. But he too told me I should just drop out. So there's people who act like they know everything all over the place, telling you, and they actually have no idea what they're talking about, and they don't know it. And the only reason they can hold these jobs is they're surrounded by other people who don't know what they're talking about. It's not like there's a lot of talent in the teaching department and in the agent department. When somebody did see me in something in 1960 with Robert Redford and James Caan, he was an assistant agent. I called to get his boss to watch. He said, "I saw you. What part?" I saw that. What part do you? I told him. He said, "I think you're." He was very enthusiastic, and he went to his boss. Said, "We should sign this guy." And the boss didn't even bother to look at it, and he said, "He'll probably be another Eli Wallach, but who's got the time?" Well, this guy became an agent, and he was the only one who ever had any interest in me, and I was his first client. His second client was Martin Scorsese. His third client was Robert De Niro. Then there was Joe Clayburgh, Jodie Foster. He could see something in people. The others, good luck. The main point I want to make here is be very careful listening. And I was going to send my son to this class, and this woman I knew was teaching, and she says, then I asked the class for their opinions of what the student actor did. That's when I said, "Oh, let me out of here." Because who are the class? So kids are now going to crush your confidence, beat you down, and even when I was doing what you were supposed to do is like try to personalize the situation. I remember Uta Hagen saying, "Look at him working on his personalizations there." If I seem angry about it, I am angry about it, because they were doing this for years, and they were stupid. So the value of studying acting is if you could just get up there and perform. You're better off if nobody would say anything, that you just get used to and work on it yourself. I still do. I always carry a pad and a pen in my pocket. I would lie awake at night and just try to think of how do you do this? How do you do this? And worked it through myself. Parenthetically, when I came to New York, I was living in a room with no window, no bathroom. Still there. It's Capitol Hall Hotel on between 87th Street, between Columbus and Amsterdam. It has since been upgraded to a homeless shelter. That's how bad it was. I visit these homeless shelters now, and I find that I'm most comfortable at the homeless shelters for the mentally ill. I don't know what that says about me, but they have me. I'm like specialized in sitting with the mentally ill, and I'm most comfortable with them. So that's you should just know this, and if in spite of everything that other people would tell you, that is the percentage. 5% out of a million might make a living, and 1% anyone would have heard of you. That's how many people go into show business. And in my case, there were a number of people at the Pittsburgh Playhouse, in Uta Hagen's class, at Lee Strasberg's class, that were excellent. They were really good. But the amount of rejection is unending, and they just went away, so you never saw them. There was a young woman at the Pittsburgh Playhouse who was as good as Audrey Hepburn and better looking. I never saw her in anything. So you have to know what you're getting into, and you don't want to spend too much of your life beating your head against the wall, because that's what it's like. And so that's what I have to say about acting. On directing, after I did my first Broadway show, and it was standing room only, and I didn't get another offer for a job until 2 years later, and in that second play, it was filled with a lot of name actors. I was an unknown young man in the cast, and very shortly into rehearsals, the director, Oscar Hammerstein's son, named Jimmy Hammerstein, invited me to join the writer and him in the script conferences. Well, the older cast members were like stunned, like, what's that kid doing there? And some of them were friends of mine and said, why would you, the junior member of the company, be sitting in the script conferences? What are you saying in there? I said, well, I'll tell you what I'm saying. The play was called Absence of a Shell. It was about a physicist. And the playwright had spent about 4 pages of dialogue, maybe more, establishing him as a physicist, speaking with language that nobody would know what he was talking about. They want to establish him. And all I said was, the audience will accept what you say you are. You can want to do a page, a half a page. They will accept. You're a physicist. That's all. Let it go. Ruth White, God rest her, who was my friend who was in the cast, she said, well, that's so they invited me to do that. Out of that, the producer of the show noticed this and noticed that things got better, and he asked me to come in. He asked me one day to come to his office, and he said, would you like to direct something? And I said, what? And he says, here's the script. He hands me the script, and he takes a phone call, and I start reading through the script. And I said, are you serious? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, this is it's just to be kind. It wasn't strong enough to be a show produced in New York. Had a lot of cliches in it. And I said, I don't understand, because this had been a well-known producer. Why? He said, they're bringing me all the money, the writer, the director, the music, the lyricist, all that. So I said to the same fellow who represented me as an agent what had happened. He said, why don't you make it a satire? If it has every cliche, why don't you satirize the cliches? It was a musical, in the musical theater. I said, well, just satirize it, so you have to rewrite the whole thing. So I decided, okay, let me see if I can do that, because I knew something about the musical theater. And I went out and met with the writer, who was a practicing dentist in Newark, New Jersey. And I said, to be gracious to him, I said, I think I have an idea we can make it even better than this. And we began this rewrite, and at one point, during one session, he actually took care of a filling for me in my tooth. It's all true. The show opens in New York, off-Broadway at Theater 4, which is still there. I don't know if it's called that now, on 54th Street, I think. It was about big cast, I think 15 people, maybe more. It was a smash in previews. Opening night, the costume designer, because she was so angry at the producer who hadn't paid her, she stole all the costumes. And so the curtain's ready to go up, but there's no costumes. And you need the costumes in this show. It's not just street clothes. Excuse me. The police are called. The audience sits there and waits. The producer gets up and makes the worst possible little announcement you can make, due to technical difficulties beyond our control, which, of course, charmed no one. Pretty soon, this is a time when the critics would all come on the same night, so they're all there. And pretty soon that you get the audience, can we go? About a half an hour late, the curtain goes up. It was the only night ever that show didn't play to a huge response, because they were angry already. In spite of that, probably the toughest critic at that time, a man named Martin Gottfried, who was reviewing for Women's Wear Daily, gave it a rave review and called it one of the 9, I don't know where it came to 9 best shows on or off Broadway that year. It was a very hip show. I didn't see Spam-A-Lot, but it was just kind of ahead of its time, but it was very, very hip. And it closed in a certain amount of time. So then I went on and directed other things. But the point about directing is, one piece of advice to would-be directors: don't criticize actors. Suggest they do something else. I really learned that from Elaine May. She never puts you down. She never says anything negative to you. She suggests something else. The best thing you can do as a director is to be supportive, make the actor feel like you like him and that you're for him, and try this and try that, and et cetera, et cetera. So the worst thing is to take shots, which some directors, for some bizarre reason, think is a good idea. Jerome Robbins was known for that. In fact, one of the actors in Mother Courage threatened to come off the stage and beat the hell out of him. He probably should have, because he was just bullying people in the company. But essentially, it's be supportive. If you have an idea for something, suggest it to them. Don't say anything negative. And strangely enough, when I did the first Beethoven movie, on the first day of filming, the director said, "I really liked that moment where you did some specific thing I did." And I went to him at the end of the day and I said, I appreciate that you like what I'm doing, but I think it's really better not to call my attention to what exactly I'm doing, because I don't know. I'm kind of in the situation. I don't know. I can't tell you exactly what I'm doing. I'm just involved in a situation. Well, he thought I was nuts. He just thought I was nuts, but he was nuts. And I hope he learned from that. Don't tell somebody something good they do, because they'll be self-conscious. I did 2 movies that were written by Neil Simon. The first was The Heartbreak Kid, which was Elaine May directing, and completely opened it up to improvisation. And Neil Simon, I thought she had cleared this with him beforehand, but on the first day of Jeannie Berlin and me singing, we were rehearsing songs we were going to do on our way down on our honeymoon, singing in the car. And Neil Simon's in the back of the theater, and he says, rehearsal place, he says, "Where does it say they sing?" Pretty soon he just disappeared, which is the best thing he could have done for the movie. And it turned out to be a very, very good movie, because a great deal of it was improvised, based on his script and story. Oddly enough, it's not his story. The story was by Bruce J. Friedman. 1 year before I did The Heartbreak Kid, I was the third person. First, this was a play that starred Dick Shawn, who's since deceased. Then they brought in Rip Torn. They fired Dick Shawn, they fired Rip Torn, then they brought me in. I was unknown. The director was Anthony Perkins. He got the job because I recommended him, and I knew one of the producers. Now the play is starting to take off, because I was writer for the role than those guys, and I was a more whatever. But since it was starting to take off, they were such in the hole from all the money they spent on previews. They felt that they needed a name in the cast. So who do they get? They get Anthony Perkins to come in. He was directing a movie, or not doing a movie somewhere in Hollywood, and he came in and he finished that, and he took over for me, which ended our friendship. You can't replace somebody who got you the job, is the moral of that story. About writing, well, you know, it's different things. I've written plays, I've written movies, I've written television specials, I've written books. So it's all very different. Takes a long time. If you want to do it, have a fallback plan. Whether it's acting, writing, or directing, have a fallback plan, because overwhelmingly you won't be successful. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try. If you want to hang in there and do it, I began my backup. I mean, how I supported myself. I was a night watchman on the Brooklyn waterfront. That's $1.62 an hour. If you did it in Manhattan, it was only $1 an hour. I was in a full dress uniform. I looked like a cross between a Marine and an usher. And I'm just on the Brooklyn waterfront. It's like the hardest job, because I just sat there. And that's when I learned that the hardest job is doing nothing. And my favorite job, which I would take ahead of acting in movies any day, was driving a cab in New York City. I don't say today, because today it's just, but in the early 60s when I did it, I liked it. I actually liked it. You got to go around, you got to meet people, you get to talk to people, this and that, And I was then, also in there, I think at some point, I stopped doing that, and I got a job at the post office in New York, in Manhattan, the planetarium station. And I showed one of my colleagues there, a TV guide, and there was a network show that I was, sounds odd, but I was the guest star on. I said, look at that. And he says, he's got the same name you do. I said, no, that actually is me. He said, well, if you're starring in a network television show as a guest star, why would you be working in the post office? And I thought, that's when I quit. Now, that didn't mean I then began to make money as an actor. I mean, the first 10 years of my career, I had made about $3,000 a year for the first 10 years. And when I did finally start making, I think everybody fainted. I mean, from my family, or where I came from in Pittsburgh. So writing, it's all very different. I write a lot. I write commentaries. I do thousands of them. I've been doing that for CBS Radio for 9 years. So it's different. It's a commentary, it's your opinion, a book. Maybe one thing that my wife taught me that I think is worth repeating. She had been a critic for the Times of London, and she said, you must understand that every writer falls in love with his own material. So I don't go by what I think. I very much am, especially if it's a play. I would never send a play to anybody unless I'd seen it performed in front of audiences. The audience must judge it, not me. Naturally, I'm going to be for it. I wrote it. So that's it. You have to listen to other people as a writer, and that goes for whatever form it is, whether it's a commentary, whether it's a book, a play, whatever it is. So it's tricky, but the one thing acting, directing, and writing all have in common is you have to have a lot of patience, and it's very important to have a backup plan, because overwhelmingly people do not make a living. I have a particular fondness for Ivan Reitman because he cast me as the dad in the first two Beethoven movies, but there's a bigger reason than that. The first two Beethoven movies were far and away the most popular movies I'd ever done. But really why I want to thank him is he did this against the wishes of the head of the studio, Universal Pictures. I had never met Ivan Reitman. The head of the studio didn't like me. I later learned this. And he told Ivan Reitman that I wasn't likable enough to be the dad in the Beethoven movies. And Ivan Reitman, who had never met me, but he had done Animal House and Ghostbusters, he had the clout, and he said, he's plenty likable. That's without meeting me. So then when I heard about this, I started to think, what what is it with this guy? I wouldn't know the guy if he walked in the room right now. I understand he still doesn't like me. Someone told me this, and I realized it was during the filming of Midnight Run, and he must have been on the set sometimes, and I don't socialize very much, particularly in a movie like that. And probably more to the point, I would treat a studio executive, a studio head, whomever, the same as I would treat a doorman, anyone. And some people don't like that. The doorman likes it. Some studio executives, it's subtle, but if you're not looking up to them, it's a very subtle thing. They really resent it because they expect that. It's a subtle thing, and I don't know. I just wasn't socializing with them, but I never did that with anybody. Then there was Robert Altman, who famous, very gifted director. Somebody introduced me to him because he likes improvisation and I like to improvise, and I was talking to Robert Altman the same way I would anybody else, which caused him to say 5 minutes in, "I know I should like you, but I don't." And I can only assume because I wasn't there long enough to be disliked. And it must have been because my attitude was just like we're person to person. There was no bowing and scraping. Then there was the director of the movie, of the play I directed, Thieves, who, when I first met with him, he said, "You know, I yell at people." And I just stared at him. And he said, "Well, I wouldn't yell at you." I said, "Well, I really don't think it's a good idea to yell at anyone." So we start the movie, and Professor Irwin Corey's in it, and he's in his 90s now, but he wasn't a young man then, and he starts screaming at Irwin Corey. Then he starts screaming at the children. There were children in the movie. He starts screaming at the children. So I called up with the agreement of Herb Gardner, who wrote the play and the screenplay. I called up George Barry, who owned Brute. They were financing the movie, and I said, "This director should be fired." He said, "Why?" I said, "You want the short version or the long version?" He says, "Give me the short version." I said, "He's yelling at people. He's yelling at children. He's yelling at Irwin Corey. There's something wrong with him. He's just yelling at everyone." There was a pause, and George Barry said to me, "What's the long version?" I said, "Well, it's raining on one side of the street." He was fired. Then there was a director. He meant well. He meant well. But the first day of filming, I had to run across a backyard and stub my toe. And honestly, I mean, I'd done a lot of movies by then. I think they had it on the first take. He had me do somewhere between 10 and 15 takes. And as I look back on it, I realized what he was trying to do was to establish who was the boss, which is totally unnecessary because the director's the boss. I'm not the boss. I'll come into a movie and say, "I'm going to suggest this, I'm going to improvise this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. If you don't like it, don't use it." So he unnecessarily tried to establish something that didn't have to be established. He was a good guy. He just made a mistake on that, and I think very shortly after that he realized I was no threat to him and I wouldn't do anything to upset him, whatever, so he stopped with that kind of... Maybe my... as bad an experience as I ever had with a director was on Rosemary's Baby with Roman Polanski. It was my first big movie, and Roman Polanski had directed some wonderful movies and is a wonderful director. But this is in a scene where Mia Farrow comes to me as her doctor and tells me the devil is after her, that her neighbors and her husband, they're trying to get her to do things to give birth to the devil. And she says all this to me, and I look at her and I go, "You may be right," you know. And then I give her a sedative, put her to sleep, and call in her husband and the very people who were doing exactly what she had said. But you know, if a woman's about to give birth and you're a gynecologist and says that she's going to give birth to the devil, you probably wouldn't believe her. You probably would think something is happening here. So Roman Polanski comes up to me after we did that, and he says, "Take out the pause." I said, "You mean after Mia tells me the whole story, you just want me to say," she finishes saying, "The devil's after us"? I said, "You're probably right. You may be right." I said, I think if I say it that quickly, the audience is going to know I don't believe, or at least they possibly might believe it if it looks like I'm thinking about it a little bit. He says, "Look, they pay me a lot of money to do this." I said, "Well, they don't pay me a lot of money, but I have a very good reputation. I've been on Broadway, and I had a very good reputation as an actor. And what's in the film is probably something in between what Roman Polanski wanted and what I wanted. And after we finished shooting that day, I went up to him and I said, you know, Roman, I've been thinking about what you said about that pause, and you know, I agree with you. He says, good, good. I said, did you just believe me? He said, yes. I said, no, I don't agree with you at all. I was just trying to make the point that the longer the pause, the more likely it is. We stared at him and he tried to figure out if he admired me or hated my guts. And he decided right then and there he admired me. Threw his arms around me, took me to dailies, watched Ruth Gordon, Ralph Bellamy. I'm sitting, I'm his best friend. The next morning after he slept on it, he decided after all, he hated my guts. So the first time I said anything, he says, I don't care what you do. And as years went by, people would see him at different festivals and say, you know, you gave Charles Grodin his first role in a major movie, and they get a very kind of frozen reaction from Roman Polanski. Then there was the producer Ray Stark, who produced more than one movie I did, and in one of these movies, he was tormenting the director. He was just terrible with the director, which I really didn't appreciate. And not only that, but he, on his own, he had an editor cutting his version of the movie, which just isn't done. You let the director do that, then you can have your input. It just isn't. He behaved very badly toward this woman director. And I think it was in some magazine, maybe People magazine, his name came up, and I said, you know, Ray Stark thinks that you're supposed to come in with a shot sheet. 1, 2, do you stand over, blah, 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 blah. But the best directors come in and they look and they take input from the actors, and everything isn't so cut and dried and fixed this way, and Ray Stark doesn't seem to understand that. Well, he obviously read it, and he gets a hold of a journalist who was sitting in for the famous journalist in New York, columnist Earl Wilson. This fellow's name was Tim Boxer. I haven't heard his name in many, many years. And he gets Tim Boxer to put in a column in I think in the New York Post, that Jill Clayburgh leaves Charles Grodin for Michael Douglas, and it's my turn. Goldie Hawn leaves Charles Grodin for Chevy Chase, and seems like old time, but it doesn't seem to bother his live-in girlfriend, and he named my girlfriend at the time, even though, meaning me, even though he wears a girdle and a wig. Well, you know, I don't wear a girdle and a wig. It was just. Oh, and in movies, you can do stuff with your hair. You do hairpiece, whatever the part, whatever best serves the role, you do that. But you made it sound like in life, I'm walking around with a wig and a girdle. Just a real mean-spirited guy. So you got this clown, Tim Boxer, to print that. I don't know where he is, but I hope he gets a chance to see this. My least favorite person I ever came into contact with, and I've written about him in I think more than one book, is Elliot Kastner, who produced a movie I did in London, and felt compelled to let me know early on. We were having lunch in the commissary over there, and he said, you know, the studio doesn't like you. They don't like me. What about Candice Bergen? She was the leading lady. They like her. John Gielgud, they like him. James Mason, they like him. Trevor Howard, they like him. They just don't like you. I later heard that he had told the people at the studio, that in this case 20th Century Fox, that I spent more time in makeup than Candice Bergen did. Of course, leaving out that Candice Bergen didn't spend any time in makeup because she did her own makeup at home. In other words, he was trying to, later the studio head said you were Kastnerized, because if he feels like the picture's not going to be a success, he tries to find somebody to hook it on. So he would do that with me. They don't like you, he spends too much time in makeup, all this. I've never been late for a shot at all, and I spend about the same time in makeup as anybody else does. I mean, right now I have no makeup on, so I spent no time in makeup for this. The other thing he did, Elliot Kastner, was the real problem on that movie, 11 Harrow House, was the still photographer. I was writing the movie and the lead actor, and it takes a lot of concentration. You don't want someone snapping your picture endlessly while you're on camera, while you're talking to the other actors, or you're talking to the director. He kept firing away, snap, 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 and the director tried to back him up, but the producer, Elliot Kastner, once more, no, he didn't. He was okay with him, that this guy was so distracting to me. We once had lunch. I said, I'm going to have lunch with this still photographer. I don't know if I ever knew his name. And I remember something he said at that. I explained to him, this is very distracting. And he said, well, I've got a job to do. And I was so dumbfounded when he said that, I couldn't even say, your job is to get still shots, and my job is to write the movie and play the leading role. And if I tell you your job maybe is a little less important, I was dumbstruck by him. I later ran into him on another picture. I forgot his name, but he knew I saw him there, and I think he kept his distance from me by then. But I see this all over the place in movies, particularly if you see people testifying in front of Congress, or sometimes there could be 75 photographers there while they're testifying on complicated issues, which I think is nuts. You can get your pictures and get out of there. Get out of there. We're talking about crucial military things, crucial things to the nation. These people are snapping away between the general, whomever it is, and the people sitting up high on the, looking down at these people. So there was a critic named Murph. He was the leading critic for Variety, the trade magazine. And in the second movie I played a leading role in, he ended it by saying, first he ripped me to shreds, and then he said, at the last line of the review was, it would be sad to think an acting career lay ahead. Well, the next year I won a Best Actor award on Broadway. And I just thought, he's just one of these critics who just thinks they know everything. But when he passed away within the last few years, it was very interesting. I actually read this in his obituary. It said he was very, very snappish around the office, which is, of course, horrible. Then it said he really enjoyed dressing up in women's clothes, which, look, to each his own. You want to dress up in women's clothes, it's up to you. But this is who's reviewing for Variety. He's very mean-spirited around the office, and he likes to dress up in women's clothes. So then there was John Simon, who's notorious, still around, like a killer critic. I was at some gathering, and he was there, and he knew I was there, and he also knew I was avoiding being anywhere near him because he just was I haven't read him in years, but he would not only attack the performer, he would attack even women, particularly women. He would attack their looks in a very disparaging way, and I really resent it. Finally, he corners me, and I'm standing there. He's got a young woman with him, his date, and he says, I hear you don't like me. And I said, that's right. He said, well, I've always given you very good reviews. I said, I'm aware of that, but I don't like the way you write about people. He says, well, why do people take it so personally? People attack me, and I don't take it personally. And his date says, oh, yes, you do, John. So these people are so nuts. They have no idea what they're doing, and they can't even. He doesn't take it personally. He does take it personally. He doesn't know it's wrong to describe. It's enough to say I didn't care for this actress's performance, but then to describe her looks. And this was one actually very beautiful woman. I remember this, and I won't even repeat what he said. It was so ugly and mean. Then on the other end of the spectrum, a very dear friend of mine was a critic named Richard Watts Jr., who's no longer living. And he was the exact opposite. He always said, this is subjective, it's only my opinion, I realize this. He was the nicest gentleman, critic, that I've ever met in my life. I remember I was with him on his 80th birthday. I was devoted to him. We would go out every Friday night. With a group of people, we would go out in New York. I lived in New York at the time. And he's standing, greeting people his 80th birthday, and he looked every bit of it. And I said, Dick, you could sit down in a chair, and he said, you think that's all right, Chuck? I said, absolutely. I mean, he was the gentleman's gentleman, Richard Watts Jr. I had worked for Candid Camera in the 60s, and I was fired 3 times in a 6-week period. Alan Fine had seen me in a Broadway show and hired me. I have no idea why. Nothing in the Broadway show would suggest that I'd be good for Candid Camera. I don't know what made him do that, but he hired me, and I couldn't start right away. I had another commitment for 6 months to do something. And then after the 6 months, I came in, and the first day I'm there, his associate producer, who wasn't there when he hired me, a woman named Ann Richardson, she comes in, she says, so Alan hired you when I was away. I said, uh-huh. She said, well, let me hear some of your ideas. Well, I had a lot of time. I kind of overdo stuff. I don't come in with 3 or 4 ideas. I came in with like as many as dozens of ideas. And to every single thing I said, she said, no. Oh, we've done that. No, we've done something like that. No, that won't work. No. And after about the 15th or 16th or 35th no, I could see that she resented that I'd been hired while she was away. And I finished. She said no to every single thing I said. And she said, well, what would you like to do? I think she thought I was going to say, well, I'll leave, you know. I said, well, why don't we talk to Alan Funt? Because I know I can be wrong. Believe me, I know I can be wrong. I just don't think I can be wrong 50 times in a row. So we get down. Alan Funt had just come out of his sauna with towels wrapped around him. He says, what's the best idea you think you have? And I told him this idea, and he said, okay, go ahead and do it. And the idea was that I was going to be a young man from Pittsburgh, and I'm coming to New York, and I want to pursue a singing career. And we get Joey Fay, the old burlesque comic, to be my uncle, who promised my mother, his late sister, that he would back me in a singing career, but he wanted to get some input from professional coaches. So we paid a professional coach to call half a dozen other professional coaches. He said he had to be away. And these other guys would come into his studio, which was all mics and everything, you know, hidden mic, hidden cameras, all that. And the piano player, of course, is with us, and the coach is sitting between Joey Fay and the piano player. He's sitting in the middle between two people who are looking at me as though, and I say, I'll do Be My Love, which was like an operatic piece that a singer named Mario Lanza made famous. And I can't, you know, I'm not a professional singer. But I let go as just, you know, just really loud and sincere, you know, just as though I actually thought I was good. And I finish, and everybody, and the first one was a woman, and she's like looking around out of the corner of her eye at Joey Fay and at the piano player to see, are they as astonished at what they're hearing as he would? But they all acted like, you know. And I say, and nobody spoke after it was finished, and just looked at her, and she says, it's warm in here. Is it warm in here? She was at a loss for words. Another woman coach said, I manage a baritone that the New York Times has called one of the 10 finest singers in America, and this man cannot make a living. And I said, does he have my range? So anyway, we go back, and I get back to my office, and I get a call from my agent. He said, congratulations. I thought, wow, that's nice. I mean, word got that fast that it was so good. Then I realized he's congratulating me because Candid Camera was known to fire people, not usually on the first day. They fired me on the first day. And I went to talk to Alan Funt, and he said, look, you can't get professionals in there. They like to get messengers and people like that. The professionals, they already got some phone calls threatening lawsuits. You can't do that. And I was also told that you kind of took over. And I said, well, I'm the writer-director. I thought that's what I was supposed to do, is take over. Anyway, I said, well, why don't you look at the footage? And he did, and he thought it was funny, and so he rehired me. And then I got fired another time, and then rehired me again. And the last time he has this idea we should go out to JFK Airport and close down the men's room. So when people come off the plane, it's just a fake men's room door. I said, oh, gee, Alan, you know, I don't see, I think people come off, they're just not going to be amused by that. You know, it's a joke, it's Candid Camera, ha, ha, ha. Well, it was terrible, just as I thought it would be. It was just, people were angry, it wasn't funny. And I get a call at the airport that I'm fired again. So that's how I got fired 3 times in a 6-week period. Oddly enough, after I directed some award-winning specials, I get a call from Alan Funt, or my agent did, wanting to know if I wanted to direct a Candid Camera special. I said, oh, no, it's okay. You know, 3 times was enough. I'd like to say something about Johnny Carson. I appeared on Johnny Carson in early 1973 because I had done this movie, well, I'd done Rosemary's Baby, then I'd done Catch-22, where I threw a girl out the window, because I was nuts in Catch-22. And Alan Arkin comes in and says, what did you do? You just threw this girl out the window, it's a prostitute. And I said, well, a lot of people get killed in wartime. Then I did the Heartbreak Kid, where I leave my wife on my honeymoon, and I was going to go on Johnny Carson to kind of let people know that I really wasn't this guy who's going to leave my wife on his honeymoon or throw somebody out the window or turn people over to the devil or any of these things. Because people would actually, when they'd meet me, they'd actually think I was this actual person who turned Mia Farrow over to the devil. And so I got onto Johnny Carson. I was unknown. At that time, the show went from 11:30 to 1 o'clock. Now, my first appearance was at 6 minutes to 1, 6 minutes. And I went on, and for 6 minutes, I was effective for 6 minutes. And then 3 weeks later, they had me on again at 9 minutes to 1. And I was sufficiently effective that he actually put me under contract exclusively as a guest, which he'd only done before with David Steinberg and Joan Rivers. Well, as time went on, and I became the first guest, and it wasn't 6 or 9 minutes, it would be 15, 20 minutes, and I realized I can't do this every 3 weeks. I just can't sit down and start talking about, oh, this amusing thing happened or that amusing. That's when I developed this character of this disagreeable character, and played it well enough that it started to make Johnny Carson uncomfortable. And he actually had me banned, not from the show. Needless to say, I was no longer under contract, but the guest host, Bill Cosby, and people like that would book me. And he's sitting at home and he's watching it, and pretty soon he has me back on, and I'm still doing this. He'd say to me things like, so how are you? And I said, well, I really don't want to answer that question because you have no interest in how I am, do you? He says, no, not really. You're just a body to me. I come here, I tell you. And he started, and he said to me during a commercial break once, I never knew what to do with you. Now I see I can do anything with you. I said, yeah, you really can. So at some point after he retired, he asked me to, I had no social relationship with him. I mean, when you do that show and you run into him in the makeup room, it's pressure because you can't just say, hi, Chuck, hi, Johnny. Somehow you're expected to be witty on the spot, which is a lot of pressure. But he called me and he said, I don't know how, he probably didn't call me. I was contacted when I'm out in Los Angeles, would I like to have dinner with his wife and him? And I was just starting my cable show. I said, okay. I was a little wary about it because I'd never been alone with him in front of a camera. It was something different. It was an act, And I come in and he's sitting there with his wife. I sit down, the three of us, and I start talking about this new cable show I started on CNBC. And he looks at me like this. Openly bored. And instead of it offending me, I said, well, what do you find interesting? He starts telling me a story about something that happened in astronomy 75,000, I don't know. I found it, I said, you find that more interesting than a show business anecdote? Anyway, we went back and forth, and he invites me to go to Africa with him on a safari. I said, you want me to sleep in a tent with you, with wild animals trying to get? This is a guy I hoped I didn't even pass in the hall. Now he's asking, and I didn't do it. And later, when he passed away, I said, that's something I should have done. I should have just gone with him. And the fact that he would reach out to me like that was so unusual for him. He wasn't a guy who embraced that many people, and so that's a big regret because he was an important person to me, and it was very sad for me to learn that he had been married, I don't know, let's just say more than a couple times. And I didn't realize he was alone at the end of his life, that he had parted from his last wife as well. And then he developed emphysema. And it's a very sad story because he brought so much joy to so many people and personally didn't have as much as he deserved. Then there were stunt people on Midnight Run. I don't know if it's second unit, I'm not sure what they were, but this is a scene where I have to be, I'm in the rapids. It's a rapid sequence with De Niro and me, and I'm first, and they're going to take me into a boat. I've got a wetsuit under my pants, my shirt, an overcoat, and they're going to put me off the side of the boat. This is Arizona, which I think of as warm, but it wasn't. It was the winter time. They're going to drop me off the side of the boat and into the water, and they said, if anything strikes you as, wrong, just touch the top of your head. Well, up until that point, I was pretty trusting, but when he said that, I said, well, like what? He said, whatever. if anything at all. I said, well, specifically, what should I be on the lookout for? And I could see he just didn't want to answer the question. So, fully dressed with a coat, they just dropped me off the side of the boat, and I think their assumption was that the coat somehow would work as a, I think they call it a flotilla, whatever they call that. I would float with it. Well, I sunk like a rock. The weight of my clothes were, and they had to, and I tapped the top of my head and said a few choice things, and they pulled me out. They obviously had no idea what they were doing, and I get back, and we couldn't even attempt to do it. The water, you would have frozen to death. And De Niro comes down. It's his turn to get into the water, and he says, "How is it?" And I said, "When you swim in the water, keep your hands in your pockets." So we forgot about doing that. We actually went to New Zealand, where to me the water was just as cold. But we went to New Zealand to shoot that. But I'll never forget those guys. In fact, somebody was going to give us some brandy because we were both shaking. I guess he got in for a little bit. And they said, don't give brandy because I don't know what the reason. But we were in jeopardy there, not just from the freezing, but if you we're in a very vulnerable position. Even if you had drunk something, who knew? You have to be a doctor to know any of these things. Now, I've named a number of people by name who I felt deserved to be named, and in a way, I've done this as a cautionary tale to people who will see this and know if you're an acting teacher or director, whoever you are, if you're going to be abusive, someone will come along after me and make a DVD about you. So just know if you're really abusive to people, somebody's going to call you out, which is what I've done. And so to come to the end of this, I want to call one more person out. I want to call myself out for something I did that I deeply regret. And it was I don't know, sometime in the last 5 years, I was hosting an event in this area where we are now in Connecticut. And it was for the Kiwanis Club, and there was a singing group, an amateur singing group, and I had earlier established that my one attempt at this in summer stock, I was given a song to sing, and I went back to, we had 6 bunks in a garage. This was summer stock in Madison, Ohio, where we paid them $15 a week, and they let us work 16 hours a day. And I was in a garage, 6 bunks in a garage, and my mattress smelled so bad. I said, I think there's a dead rat in here or something. And after complaining a certain amount of time, they took it apart, and there was a dead rat in there. Anyway, I'm giving this song at the drop of a hat, you know, and I was mediocre at best. And I'm going back to my garage. And as I'm walking back there, I hear somebody from another garage singing at the drop of a hat. I will pick up my feet and I'll dance. And I was so naive and so young. I thought, gee, that's where my song is really catching on. I hadn't realized that meant I had been replaced and hadn't been told about this yet. And the next day, the director said to me, you know, let's have Jimmy Riley do At the Drop of a Hat. I said, Jimmy Riley? He says, yeah, let's have Jimmy Riley do it. And I looked at him and I just decided not to ask why. Now, I preface this, what I did in hosting this local event, with that story, putting myself down, and I said, now this next group, the fact that you don't have to audition for this group should in no way, there were like 50 women, middle-aged and older, who, it was an amateur group, and they were actually a lot of fun. They were very, very good. They would ring bells and dance around and sing Christmas songs. It was very charming. They were actually excellent. And you know, for what they were doing. I said, the fact that you don't have to audition for this group should in no way reflect on the group's quality. And the audience laughed, and the group hated my guts. And I thought about it afterwards, and I felt really, I still feel, I wrote a letter of apology within the last year, and this is years ago. I still feel bad that I did that. So I'm calling myself out that at least I didn't know it. Some of the people that came after me, it's hard not to know if you're screaming at someone over a PA system, or if you're screaming at children, that you're not doing something wrong. But the point of all of this is the hardest person to see is yourself. That goes for all of us. So let's all try to take a harder look at ourselves. Thank you for watching.